In the rugged wilderness of rural Montana, Jake Mitchell's quiet existence was defined by solitude and routine until the day a phone call changed everything. His uncle had passed away, leaving behind a traumatized bobcat named Max. Once vibrant and sociable, now withdrawn and refusing to eat. Despite the impending euthanasia date and against all advice, Jake made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. He brought the traumatized bobcat home. What begins as a desperate rescue soon reveals itself as something far more profound. Why does this wild predator, who once flinched at human contact, now rush to greet Jake every afternoon with the enthusiasm of a child? This is a story of patience rewarded, of trust painstakingly rebuilt, and of the extraordinary bond that can form between species when two lonely souls find solace in the most unexpected of companions. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jake Mitchell's porch as he sat in his weathered rocking chair, watching the tree line that bordered his property in rural Montana. A steaming mug of coffee warmed his hands against the autumn chill. His eyes, tired but alert, scanned the wood's edge with practiced patience. It was their daily ritual. Jake waiting, knowing that any minute now, 60 pounds of spotted fur and muscle would emerge from the foliage with all the subtlety of an excited child. On cue, a rustle of leaves announced Max's approach before the bobcat revealed himself. The animal paused at the tree line, amber eyes locked on Jake, tail twitching with anticipation. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, Max bounded across the open yard with surprising grace for his stocky frame. Jake smiled as the bobcat slowed his approach, rising up on his hind legs to press his forehead against Jake's outstretched hand. "Hey, buddy," Jake murmured, scratching behind Max's tufted ears. "What kind of trouble did you get into today?" Max responded with a chirp that rose in pitch, almost like a question, before rubbing his face against Jake's knee. 4 years ago, Jake would have sworn that such a gentle gesture was impossible from this same animal. Back then, he'd wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake bringing home a traumatized bobcat that everyone else had given up on. The call had come on a dreary March morning. Jake had been splitting firewood behind his cabin when his cell phone rang. His sister Sarah, her voice tight with a strange mixture of grief and urgency. "Uncle Frank passed away," she said without preamble. "They found him yesterday." Jake lowered himself onto a stump, the axe forgotten beside him. Frank Dawson had been their mother's brother, a reclusive wildlife rehabilitator who lived alone in a cabin nearly 3 hours away. They hadn't been close in years, but the news still hit Jake like a physical blow. "How long?" he asked, already dreading the answer. "The sheriff thinks at least 2 weeks. A neighbor got concerned when mail started piling up." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Jake, there's something else. He had this animal, a bobcat. They're talking about putting it down. Frank apparently had permits, but with him gone." Jake closed his eyes. Uncle Frank's passion for rehabilitating injured wildlife had been legendary in the family. Sometimes a point of contention, sometimes admiration. Jake had vivid childhood memories of visiting his uncle's remote property, watching in awe as the man tended to hawks with broken wings and orphaned fawns. "What's wrong with it? Is it injured?" Jake asked. "No, it's just, Frank had it for years. It was like a pet to him, but now it's not doing well, not eating. The sheriff said they've called every wildlife sanctuary within 3 states, but no one's equipped to take an adult bobcat that's been habituated to humans. They're giving it until the end of the week before they..." She didn't finish the sentence. Jake rubbed his forehead, already knowing what he was about to do. Since leaving his job as a forest ranger 2 years earlier after a back injury, he'd been living on disability and modest savings, fixing up his grandfather's old cabin. He had the space, the isolation, and perhaps most importantly, the time. "I'll come tomorrow," he said finally. "Tell them not to do anything until I get there." Jake hadn't been prepared for what awaited him at Uncle Frank's property. The small cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pine forest, unremarkable except for the collection of outdoor enclosures built with meticulous attention to detail. Most were empty now, but one, larger than the others and constructed of heavy wire mesh and wooden support beams, contained a sight that stopped Jake in his tracks. Sheriff Dawkins, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes that belied his stern demeanor, had met Jake at the property and now stood beside him, both men observing the Bobcat inside the enclosure. "That's Max," the sheriff said quietly. "Frank had all the proper permits. Had him for about 6 years from what we can piece together. Rescued him as a kid when his mother was killed by a car." Max was huddled in the farthest corner of the enclosure, his once muscular body now gaunt and hunched. His fur was dull and patchy in places, lacking the healthy sheen Jake associated with wild cats. But it was the animal's eyes that truly revealed his suffering. Vacant and glazed, yet somehow holding a depth of grief that felt eerily human. "He hasn't eaten more than a few bites since we found Frank," the sheriff continued. "The vet checked him out yesterday, said physically he's okay, just dehydrated and underweight, but..." He gestured vaguely. "Animals know when something's wrong. Frank's niece said he was practically a puppy around your uncle. Followed him everywhere when he was in the enclosure. Now he just sits there." Jake approached the enclosure slowly. Max's ears flattened against his head, but he made no other movement, not even a warning growl. "Frank's notes say he was completely tame," Sheriff Dawkins added. "Said you could hand feed him and everything." Jake studied the Bobcat more closely. There was nothing tame in those eyes, only fear, confusion, and a deep exhaustion that Jake recognized all too well from his own reflection in the months after his accident. "I'll take him," Jake said, the words emerging before he could second-guess himself. The sheriff looked relieved, though concern still creased his brow. "You sure about this? He's not a house cat, despite how Frank treated him. And in this state?" He trailed off, gesturing toward the listless animal. "I've worked with wildlife before," Jake replied, not mentioning that his experience had primarily involved keeping appropriate distances from wild animals, not rehabilitating traumatized ones. "I've got space, and he knows me, at least a little. My uncle used to bring me around when I was younger." It wasn't entirely true. Jake doubted Max remembered those brief visits from years ago. But he couldn't bear the thought of this animal being euthanized simply because he'd had the misfortune of bonding with a human who'd left him behind. After signing what felt like endless paperwork and receiving a thick folder of Frank's notes on Max's care, Jake found himself driving home with a large transport cage secured in the bed of his pickup truck. The Bobcat had allowed himself to be coaxed into the carrier with surprising docility, a fact the sheriff had noted wasn't necessarily a good sign. "That's not normal behavior," he'd warned. "Be careful when he starts feeling better. That's when you'll see his real personality." The first weeks with Max tested every ounce of Jake's patience and resolve. He'd converted his tool shed into a temporary enclosure, reinforcing it and adding climbing shelves and hiding spots according to his uncle's detailed notes. Max refused to eat for the first 3 days, only lapping at water when Jake wasn't watching. When the Bobcat finally did begin accepting food, raw chicken thighs left just inside the shed door, It was only after Jake had retreated to the cabin. Progress came in microscopic increments. By the end of the first month, Max would accept food while Jake sat quietly on a stool 15 feet away. By the end of the second month, that distance had shortened to 10 feet, though any sudden movement would send the Bobcat retreating to his favorite hiding spot beneath a low shelf. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on a stormy night in late May. Thunder had been rumbling for hours, each clap seeming to shake the foundations of the cabin. Unable to sleep, Jake had been sitting on his covered porch watching the lightning illuminate the mountains when he heard it. A strange, distressed yowl coming from the shed. Grabbing a flashlight and raincoat, Jake rushed across the yard. Inside the shed, Max was pacing frantically, making uncharacteristic vocalizations that sounded almost like whimpers. When another crack of thunder shook the air, the Bobcat froze, ears flat against his head. Jake hesitated in the doorway, rain pelting his back. Uncle Frank's notes had mentioned that Max had been found as a tiny kit during a severe thunderstorm, huddled against his mother's body on the roadside. Some fears imprint deeply, persisting even when their origins are forgotten. "It's okay, buddy," Jake said softly, taking a seat on the floor just inside the door, rainwater pooling around him. "Just a little storm. It'll pass." He began speaking in a low, steady voice, not really caring what he said, telling Max about his day, about plans to fix the cabin's leaky roof, about the family of deer he'd spotted near the creek that morning. He kept his tone even and calm, a counterpoint to the storm's chaos. Gradually, Max's pacing slowed. The Bobcat made a circuit of the shed, always keeping a cautious distance from Jake, but his frantic energy seemed to dissipate with each passing minute. Jake wasn't sure how long he sat there, long enough for his clothes to become uncomfortably damp and his back to protest the hard floor. He was mid-sentence, describing the trout he planned to catch the next day, when Max did something unprecedented. The Bobcat approached, moving with deliberate slowness, and lay down approximately 5 feet away, amber eyes fixed unblinkingly on Jake's face. They remained that way until the storm passed, neither moving closer nor retreating. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first moment of genuine calm they'd shared. When Jake finally stood to leave, muscles stiff and protesting, Max watched him go without the usual retreat to his hiding spot. That night marked a turning point, though the road ahead remained long and unpredictable. There were setbacks, like the morning Jake accidentally dropped a feed bowl, sending Max into a defensive frenzy that resulted in a deep scratch across Jake's forearm. Or the week Max refused to emerge from his nest of blankets when Jake's sister visited with her 2 young children, their high, excited voices sending the Bobcat into a state of nervous vigilance. By the end of the first year, Jake had constructed a proper outdoor enclosure connected to the shed, giving Max the option to be inside or out as he preferred. The Bobcat had slowly regained weight, his coat becoming glossy again, his movements more fluid and purposeful. He would accept food directly from Jake's hand, though still tensed if Jake tried to touch him. It was in the second year that Jake began leaving the shed door open during the days he was working around the property. Max ventured out tentatively at first, never straying far from the shed's safety. Eventually, he began following Jake at a distance as he tended his small vegetable garden or repaired fencing. The first time Max voluntarily pressed his head against Jake's hand, they'd been sitting on the porch steps watching the sunset. Jake had been still for so long his coffee had gone cold, respecting the invisible boundary that still existed between them. The Bobcat had approached silently, settling beside him with several inches of careful space maintained. Then, without warning, he'd leaned over and briefly touched his forehead to Jake's hand before resuming his alert posture, as if nothing momentous had occurred. Jake had remained outwardly calm, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Thanks for that, Max," he'd said softly, not daring to push for more. By the 4th year, the present, Max moved with the confidence of an animal who knew exactly where he belonged in the world. He spent his days roaming the woods surrounding Jake's property, hunting small game and exploring, but always returned in the late afternoon for their porch ritual. Nights were spent either in his shed, which now featured a pet door allowing him to come and go freely, or occasionally curled at the foot of Jake's bed on particularly cold evenings. The change in Max was remarkable to anyone who had known him in those early days. Where once he'd been skeletal and withdrawn, he now moved with power and purpose, his spotted coat gleaming with health. But the most profound transformation was in his eyes. No longer vacant with grief, they now sparkled with intelligence, and what Jake could only describe as personality. And what a personality it was. Max had developed a penchant for collecting that both amused and exasperated Jake. It had started with small items: a work glove left on the porch, a dish towel from the clothesline. Jake would find these objects carefully arranged in Max's shed, usually nestled in the Bobcat's favorite sleeping spot. Over time, this behavior had evolved into what Jake jokingly called Max's trading post. The Bobcat seemed to assign values to different items he acquired and would only relinquish them in exchange for appropriate payment, usually in the form of treats. A kitchen sponge might be returned for 3 pieces of chicken, while Jake's reading glasses, a particularly treasured prize, had once cost him half a trout. Sarah, who had initially been skeptical of Jake's decision to take in the Bobcat, had become Max's most devoted admirer after the animal had gradually accepted her presence. "He's like a furry little person," she'd said during her last visit, watching Max methodically sorting through a pile of treasures in the corner of the shed. "I swear he understands every word we say." Jake had merely smiled, not bothering to argue. There were moments when he wondered the same thing, like the time he'd mentioned to Max that they needed to clear fallen branches after a windstorm, only to find the Bobcat dragging small sticks to the edge of the yard later that day. As the sun dipped lower behind the mountains, Jake stirred from his reminiscence. Max had settled beside the rocking chair, his large paws tucked neatly beneath his chest, eyes half closed in contentment. The Bobcat's presence had transformed Jake's quiet existence in ways he couldn't have anticipated 4 years ago. His isolation, once a shield against the world after his injury had forced an unwelcome career change, had softened into something more like peaceful solitude. Max suddenly lifted his head, ears swiveling toward the driveway. Moments later, Jake heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Sarah's minivan appearing around the bend in the drive, right on time for their weekly dinner. The Bobcat rose and stretched, a ripple of muscle beneath spotted fur, before trotting to the steps to observe the approaching vehicle. Once, the sound of a car would have sent him fleeing into the woods. Now he watched with curious attention as Sarah parked and her 2 children tumbled from the back seat. "Uncle Jake!" "Max!" 8-year-old Lily rushed forward, stopping several feet away as she'd been taught. Even with Max's remarkable progress, Jake maintained strict rules about how the children interacted with him. No sudden movements, no approaching without Max having the space to retreat if desired. Max, however, seemed to have his own ideas today. He chirped a greeting and moved toward Lily, rubbing against her legs briefly before approaching Sarah with similar affection. "Well, someone's in a good mood," Sarah laughed, carefully patting the Bobcat's head. "Jake, you won't believe what happened at school yesterday." She stopped mid-sentence, her expression changing as she noticed something in Max's mouth. "Is that my phone case?" Jake groaned as Max trotted up the porch steps, proudly displaying the sparkly purple phone case he must have snatched from Sarah's purse during his greeting. The Bobcat placed it deliberately at Jake's feet, then sat back, looking expectantly between the humans. "Seriously?" Jake sighed, reaching for the container of chicken pieces he now kept on the porch specifically for these exchanges. "What's your price today, buddy?" Max's whiskers twitched, eyes fixed intently on the container. "2 pieces," Jake offered, holding out the morsels. Max made a low, growling sound, not aggressive but clearly disapproving of the offer. "3?" Jake tried again. This time, Max chirped and delicately accepted the chicken, allowing Sarah to reclaim her phone case with a mixture of exasperation and amusement. "I swear he gets worse every time I visit," she said, inspecting the case for damage. "Last month, it was my car keys." Jake shrugged, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "He's got a system. Everything has a value." 10-year-old Noah had been hanging back, but now approached the porch slowly. "Mom says Max was really scared when you first got him," he said, watching the Bobcat clean his whiskers. "That he wouldn't let anyone touch him." Jake nodded, gesturing for the children to join him on the porch swing while Sarah went inside with the casserole she'd brought. Max positioned himself nearby, his attention divided between keeping watch over the yard and monitoring the conversation. Max had lost someone he loved very much, Jake explained, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes when that happens, it's hard to believe you'll ever feel safe again, or that you can trust someone new." Noah frowned thoughtfully. "Like when Dad left?" Jake exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, who had reappeared in the doorway. Her divorce 2 years earlier had been difficult for the children, especially Noah. "Something like that," Jake agreed. "It takes time to heal from losses." Max needed to learn that just because one person was gone, it didn't mean everyone else would leave him too. "But you didn't leave," Lily said, her eyes wide. "And now he's happy." Jake smiled, watching as Max sauntered over to rub his head against Noah's knee, as if sensing the boy needed reassurance. "He is, but it wasn't quick or easy. Some days it felt like we'd never make progress." "What changed?" Noah asked, cautiously stroking Max's spotted back. Jake considered the question. There hadn't been a single dramatic moment he could point to. Rather, 1,000 small victories strung together over years. Each represented a fragment of trust built, a measure of fear overcome. "We just kept showing up for each other," he said finally. "Even on the hard days. Maybe especially on the hard days." Sarah leaned against the doorframe, her expression soft as she watched her son with the Bobcat. "Dinner's ready whenever you all are," she said. "Though it looks like you're having an important conversation out here." Jake nodded, rising from the swing. "We'll be right in." As the children hurried inside, Jake paused, looking down at Max, who gazed back with those intelligent amber eyes. The Bobcat chirped softly and pressed against Jake's leg, a gesture that still felt like a gift each time it happened. "Come on, buddy," Jake said, holding the door open. "Family dinner time." Max trotted inside without hesitation, heading straight for his designated spot in the corner of the living room where he could observe the dining table. As Jake watched the Bobcat settle comfortably into the rhythm of their shared life, he reflected that perhaps they had rescued each other. Some wounds never completely healed. Jake still had days when his back pain confined him to bed, and Max occasionally retreated to his shed during thunderstorms. But they had found a way forward together, creating something neither could have managed alone. A family of sorts, unconventional but no less real for its strangeness. Outside, the last light faded from the sky as laughter filtered through the cabin windows. Inside, surrounded by the people who had come to love him despite his wild nature, or perhaps because of it, Max the Bobcat dozed contentedly, secure in the knowledge that he was finally, completely home.